I think we can start the rounds. All right, great. Okay, so I'll try to timestamp in the chat on 6 and 8 minute mark, but in case I miss it, I would highly encourage debaters to time your speech as well. Yeah, and with that said, on the motion that developed countries should pursue a policy of degrowth, I would like to invite the first affirmative to start the round. Here.
Hi, can you hear and see me?
Yeah, I can hear and see you.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We currently live in an era where climate change and burnout at work are some of the largest issues that people continue to face that represents an existential threat to the human race, and we're able to solve that more effectively on our side. We're so proud to propose. Two things I want to note in framing before I go into argumentation. First, this happens mostly in countries like Finland and Norway, where the degrowth movement actually began in the very first place, but it also involved like Europe and like Western parts of the world that are just more developed generally. What do these countries look like? These countries look like, for instance, having high GDP, higher per capita income, and extensive things like extensive public infrastructure, as well as large state-funded welfare programs. These might look like, for instance, having a living wage that's mandated in many Nordic countries. I just talk about the fact that you probably have a lot of resources with individuals within these particular countries anyway, and that does not change on our side of the house. You have these things within Western Europe, let's say, and in places like Scandinavia. Second, what does this look like in terms of tangible policy? In terms of tangible policy, it looks like, let's say, mandating 4-day work weeks. It looks like downsizing industries that like contribute a lot to emission to a particular extent by things like legal standards, requirements, etc. that generally have an impact on the way that these countries operate because states have regulatory power. Two arguments then. First, on why this saves us from the worst effects of climate change on our side of the house, deals with it a lot faster. Secondly, why it leads to better work environments and why that's beneficial generally. On climate change, I want to know two things in framing as I go into this. First, know that currently developed countries are the largest contributors to climate change. It looks like, for example, the US and China emitting the most amount of carbon year on year presently, and they're expected to do so like decades into the future as well. Because of the fact that you also, but this is like supplemented by the fact that you have greater consumer spending in these countries. That is to say, because of the fact that there's higher economic activity, because people are buying greater amounts of goods, you also have greater production of these goods. That's leading to greater emissions and leads to worse growth within these developed countries. One of these developed countries have the largest scale of production. They're contributing the most because of this particular fact that exacerbates what already happens. But second, know that climate change is not a future harm that might happen to humanity as a whole. It's having tangible effects right now within people's lives as well. That's why you have wildfires within California and Australia at much larger rates that destroys the housing that people continue to have in large parts. That's why you have a heat wave all across Iberia that affected and killed killed many people within, let's say, Portugal and Spain. That's why you have things like larger like hailstorms and freeze and blizzards in the US and Canada, which just led to more people dying, worse living conditions, etc. People are dying due to climate change. Climate change is making people lose their housing and lose crucial parts of their life. And this kind of urgency is best combated on our side of the house. How do we do this? First of all, know that we directly reduce things like emissions by the fact because of the fact that we shrink industry, we reduce voluntary consumption, and we just do things that are less like and we just like mandate 4-day work weeks. That means companies operate for lesser amounts of time. These lead to a direct like release and like direct reduction in the release of carbon into things like the atmosphere, which leads to broad benefits that we continue to get. So, okay, what are the direct benefits that we get? And I want to be clear on the extent of this. First of all, even if you get a very small amount of change over time, that's still something that's extremely beneficial because of the fact that if you have, let's say, like a growth of 2 degrees, like a 1.5 degrees Celsius, as opposed to, let's say, 1.75 degrees Celsius, that's still millions of people who don't have to leave their country because of the fact that these people don't actually get the production of crops like properly happening in their country because of the fact that they don't get adequate amounts of rain and because of the fact that probably like sea levels rise to a much larger extent. So to whatever extent it reduces, it's still beneficial for the most vulnerable people, especially because the most vulnerable people are those who are going to be first affected by things like climate change, and those people actually have much better like we can actually ensure that they continue to live and their work and like their lives generally aren't affected negatively because of this particular policy to like a significant large extent. But second, NEG might come in and say that, oh, this leads like this doesn't actually affect for things like climate change because of the fact that developing countries are the main contributors anyway. Three things to note with respect to this. First of all, developed countries have a principled obligation to deal with this on their own. That is to say, the reason that you have such bad like carbon emissions right now is because of the fact that the UK during the Industrial Revolution massively like increased its manufacturing and just completely destroyed things like rainforests. That is to say, you have a principled obligation to those developing countries to actually address this in the very first place. That's why you can. That's why it's like good. It's like principle for developed countries to actually go ahead with this. But second, developed countries are still very significant right now, and that leads to the urgency that continues to exist. Sure, developing countries might be contributors as well, but you can actually effectuate this change a lot easier in developed countries because of the fact that developed countries already have higher levels of economic growth and higher levels of prosperity. Developing countries do not, and they may face political pushback against causing all of these changes. Developed countries are less likely to face this, like, that political pushback in the very first place, so it's easier to get degrowth. It's easier to get that delta on our side of the house, and therefore get and like reduce the effects of climate change on our side. But third, know that we also have faster development of green tech on our side of the house, right? Why is this true? Know that developing countries might, for example, have larger industries over time, and they might manufacture greater amounts of things over time, but there's still going to be emission-based industries because of the fact that you still have cheaper fossil fuels in these countries, because of the fact that you don't actually focus on green tech and renewable technology because you want to ensure that people have jobs and you want to ensure that people have things like access to basic healthcare. You can do this in developed countries, though, even if you downsize it to a particular extent for a few reasons. Number one, you can do things like give startup breaks, for example. You have an environment that promotes things like innovation. Number two, you have greater resources within like developed countries that allow you to develop a lot faster. But third, you have better access to things like education. I mean, people are likely to be in an environment where they're able to go ahead with all these things in the very first place. So you're able to get faster development of green technology, even when you downsize the economy to a very significant extent. And therefore, you're able to then address things like climate change more effectively. But you can also then export this particular kind of goods to like developing countries within the long term in the future because of the fact that companies just have like profit incentives and they probably want to sell their technology to how many ever people that they want. That's just beneficial for them as a whole. But neg might, so that just proves that developed countries should probably go ahead with this in the first place, and it's beneficial for climate change if they do. Neg might also come in and say that jobs are lost because of the fact that these developed countries are downsizing the way that they operate. First of all, I'm just unclear why this might be true because of the fact that companies in developed countries might have the resources to operate anyway. So I think any kind of loss is just minimal. But second, and this is the more crucial part, if you weigh the benefits that you have of climate change against people who might lose their job within the short term, you're probably likely to just not, it's probably likely to be a much graver impact on them because of the fact that not only might they die in the long term because of the fact that they probably have things like larger amounts of pollution, it's probably worse for their direct proximate lives in general because their children lead shorter lives. They probably might lose their housing, for example, because of increased amounts of things like wildfire. If they're more vulnerable people within developed countries, they're probably at a higher risk of this anyways. I think we stop that on our side more effectively. But okay, that's the first argument. Let's really go to the second argument. Why you get better working conditions? Why is this so? Currently, you have a large amount of burnout and alienation in jobs, so people don't feel that jobs have any kind of particular value. We're able to reduce this because of the fact that you're able to for example, reduce the amount of time that people spend working. But note first, this does not lead to any kind of, it leads to an increase in productivity because people feel less alienation from the work that they're currently doing. That's why, for example, pilot projects all across developed countries like Australia, like Canada, like Iceland, Denmark, Finland, all of them have, like, all companies that participate in like decreased workday programs report the fact that their employees are a lot happier, and because of the fact that their employees feel that they have chances to actually go ahead and do other things with their life and actually exercise their autonomy, they're more willing to put an effort into work in the very first place because work doesn't remain something that you do out of obligation. It's something that reduces the amount of impact that it has on your life, and therefore you're a lot happier because you can actually go ahead and do other things that reflects in your working condition. So if neg wants to run the idea that okay, you have less productivity anyway, we actually have higher amounts of productivity, but even if you take them like a more charitably, you have symmetric amounts of productivity that these programs contain, like, consistently show across developed countries as a whole. It's a better policy for the future. It's a better policy for people working right now. We're so proud to propose.
All right, thank you first affirmative for that fine speech. I would like to welcome the first negative.
I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you're audible and visible.
1 minute. begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I agree that environment is very important in this debate, but I don't think scaling your economy is the solution to this. Two arguments coming from the side negative. First, why exactly developed nation is the pioneer of like the world development to the future and to the sustainable, to the like probability of like survivability of like human race. Secondly, why exactly economical descaling harms the livelihood of the world, especially the developing nation. Before that, few pieces of framing and rebuttal to the speaker before me. The first thing I'm going to deal with is the fact that they say that while there's a huge problem with the environment and we need to protect environment, I have 3 ways to actually mitigate all the harms about the environment. First, I want to note that in current status quo, there's a lot of like ethical consumer that actually opt into like greener alternative. I.e., whenever people go into like the store, they always look at the products and see whether or not like this environment, whether or not this product is actually vegan free or is vegan, whether or not this product is actually not harming the environment, whether or not the product is actually doesn't produce any carbon footprint whatsoever. Or secondly, is the fact that a lot of like, all of these consumers are actually pushing a lot of like companies who actually does a lot of like, harmful things to the environment. For example, we see a lot of protests towards the company who actually like, have polluted the environment before, things such as like H&M or also Nike. The fact that right now there's a universal goal of like every single state to reduce the emission and the pollution. We see this happen when the Paris Agreement and also the climate change, all the countries all over the world has pledged that they're going to reduce all of their carbon emission in the future. This also include US and China, which they suggested they have like produced a lot of like carbon footprint to begin with. They also has pledged that they're going to reduce all of their carbon footprint. And fourthly, the fact that right now there's a lot of like waste why people will actually opt into like greener alternatives. For example, it's the fact that because of like the fuel is expensive, more people will have to opt into like greener alternatives, things such as like solar, things such as like hydro electricity or hydropower. But secondly, it's the fact that there's a lot of like benefit for you to actually opt into like greener alternatives. Simply because of the fact that you will become like the first mover who actually like pioneer all of this technology, which means that you are able to sell all this technology and get a lot of profit to begin with. We think that's far better on our side of the house. All of these reasons prove why exactly the environmental harm will be mitigated on our side of the house. But the second thing I'm going to deal with is that I agree to you, like the climate change is going to like the climate change will be like it's important for us to protect climate change. And the principle coming from that side of the house that we have to actually protect climate change because developed nation already damaged it. I want to know to you that the way that we fulfill like this principle is not to actually descale our economy, but rather to actually opt into greener technology. And we'll prove to you why exactly on our side of the house we are able to actually fulfill this burden on our side of the house. The rest of the argument we will actually deal with the idea of like whether or not we still like deal with our worst case scenario where we still cause some form of harm to the environment, but why exactly is still like beneficial. First argument, why exactly developed nation is the pioneer of like the world development? The framing of this argument is very simple. Why exactly mutually exclusive to our side? We're the only team in this round that are able to actually garner a lot of money because we do not descale our economy. They cannot claim that they're able to actually mitigate a lot of like this harm on their side of the house because of the fact that they have to descale their economy to begin with, right? Because I want to put to you the argument coming from that side of the house suggests that well, like currently, like a lot of like this country have very high infrastructure and high wages, and that doesn't change. The main contention is that it doesn't change because of like this scaling. I want to you this doesn't make sense because on that side of the house, for them to actually get a lot of their benefit, they have to scale, which means that they also lose the capacity to actually meet all of this infrastructure, which means that it will harm the people within the country, even if like you have high wages, your wages will go down, your infrastructure will have to like this scale and becomes much smaller, which is why like they cannot simply claim that on their side of the house. But what are the benefits on our side of the house at the point where you have like a lot of money? 3 structural reasons why exactly there is a necessity for money for developed nation to have this money. First, it's for them to actually like pioneer the groundbreaking technology. I.e., if US, France, and Germany had to actually cut down all of the economic growth, it will also impact the development of like the groundbreaking technology, things such as Wi-Fi, things such as like green technology. All of these things require a lot of like research and a lot of money to begin with because research are very expensive. You need to create all this technology are very expensive to begin with. The lack of resources on both on their side of the house simply because of the fact that developing nation cannot actually do this research, and post-developed countries will not have the capacity and the money to actually invest in this research to begin with, which means that they're not going to be able to claim all the groundbreaking technology on their side of the house. This is very harmful because you cannot get things such as like NASA. You cannot get things such as like vaccines that actually reduce all of these problems simply because of the fact that you no longer have like the resources to begin with. Secondly, even if they prove that we don't need the money currently, we actually need the money over time simply because of the fact that we have to build a lot of prices. There already a prediction that that a lot of crises are happening every 5 years. What's going to happen is that the US is actually the biggest donator in terms of like solving the poverty crisis, and also France and also a lot of the developed nations are the one who actually like develop a lot of like vaccine, and also they're the one who actually donate a lot of vaccine to other countries. On their side of the house, at the point where you reduce all of these things, there's no longer capacity for them to produce all of this like money to actually like ensure they're able to solve the future crisis. We think that's very, very harmful on their side of the house. Finally, it's the expansion of the countries to a different state and different countries. Frankly, they have a lot of like MNCs like Johnson and Johnson, IBM, and also Apple decided to develop within developing nations simply because of the fact that they want to increase and also like improve the countries so they are able to open up their factories. This is important because that's how you are able to actually like develop those countries into the future and to like alleviate them from like the poverty and also like the worst state of like their life. This argument is important for two reasons. Number one, this argument proves to you why exactly like all of the benefits of the money is exclusive to us. They cannot simply claim like they can also claim on their side of course. But secondly, I want to note to you that a lot of like, this harm is actually about the survivability of the future human race to begin with, right? Which means that on their side of the house, we are literally condemning all the human race into like damnation where like they're not able to solve things such as like climate change, things such as like the future livelihood, right? Second argument then, why exactly the economical degrowth harms the livelihood of the rest of the world? Let's assume you don't believe my first argument why exactly the development of the country, the development of the world is important. Why exactly developed nations not having enough money is actually harmful to the rest of the world. I have two layers to prove to this. Number one, it's the fact that developing nations right now are the one who actually have the biggest supplier in terms of like, any kind of food or any kind of supply chain in the world. Take a look at, for example, what happened after like, Russia decided after the sanction towards Russia. What happened was that the cost of like, the oil increased, the cost of like the food increased, simply because of the fact that Russia was actually the supplier of the oil and also like food to begin with, right? What will happen at the point where countries such as US and also Canada decided to descale? That means that they also have to cut down a lot of their production. This is harmful because US and also Canada are the exporter of the corn and potatoes to all around the world, which means that the prices will increase in the future. But secondly, that means that you also have to reduce employment within your country and also the MNC all over the world itself. Because the fact that you have to descale your companies because you're following like the growth policy, that means that you also have to actually lay down a lot of workers simply because of the fact that you want to descale and reduce like the amount of like profit and also like the consumption that you are creating. What are the harms here? Because the conclusion to this analysis is that you are literally like condemning all of the world actually to like a worst state of like economical growth. The harm here is number one, poor people life will be worsened off. The fact that they're not able to get jobs, the fact that they're not able to access all the food simply because of the fact that all the food prices increase because of inflation happen when you have higher demand but you don't have enough supply to begin with. Secondly, it's the fact that there will be no more climate change buy-in simply because of the fact that a lot of people are actually suffering because their main goal is to actually like, protect the environment. A lot of people will blame the environment, but also I want to note that a lot of people who actually don't have enough money to survive every single day are not able to join the fight to actually ensure the environment are actually going to get better. That means that you're going to harm the environment fight even worse. The third thing is about inflation. Inflation is just bad because of it harms the livelihood. The weighing of this is that all of the harm that we talk about harms targeted towards the developing nation, even worse, it harms all around the world. For all those reasons, environmental might be the most important thing in this debate, but there are a lot of things you also have to consider for this reason. Vote off.
All right, thank you first negative for that fine speech. I would like to welcome the second affirmative.
All right, can you hear me? All right.
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Just quickly want to deal with two extraneous things that comes right in the end. One, in terms of inflation, that is less likely to happen because you're reducing consumption as well. This is just comparatively less demand. At that point of time, there's less likelihood of inflation happening in the economy. But secondly, in terms of poor people, we've already characterized right from the get-go, this is a developed country. This is largely likely to be a country like Norway or Sweden, etc. These most people essentially are not on the poverty line. Most people essentially are not like putting, like literally like struggling at 9 to 5 to essentially put food on the table, which is the proportion of poor people. We don't say like nobody exists, like, but the proportion of this is incredibly low. Plus, they're very strong, say for example, welfare schemes and like what you call public welfare systems and minimum wage laws, which is very less likely that individuals are so much on the line in terms of poverty, etc. that they want to push for. This is not the most vulnerable people in this debate, at least in terms of scale. All right. I think there's only one clash in this round as far as the first negative is concerned. There's more development of greener technology. At best, side negative proves that you have more money. They never prove why that money needs to be incentivized and put into green tech, why there is an incentive and political will for that money to be channelized into green tech. Just because if countries have money does not essentially mean that it's going to be fueled into greener technology. Why does that happen on our side of the house? What is the political will in the West largely going to look like? Point at which, when you essentially push the Western countries to adopt into degrowth, I think at that point of time, you essentially push political systems and you push the will towards, say, for example, moving towards more climate-friendly technologies. This is because the comparative, as the info slide literally says, that you continue to make emissions, you continue to burn fossil fuels, you continue to be reliant on things like petroleum and gas. Point at which that is valid, it's unlikely in terms of why there is a political will to shift to greener technology. This simply looks like right now under the present status quo, you have a rise of green parties in Europe. Like say, for example, in countries like Germany, where they have realized that you need to essentially reduce the amount of reliance and fastly move towards greener technology. That's why you have people like Annalena Baerbock, who recently won elections and came into power in Germany. You have the Greens in France, who essentially entered into a political coalition with Emmanuel Macron and ensure that the center left retains power in France. We want this to happen more. That is to say, you want the Greens and the Labour Party in the UK to also win elections and become more prominent. You want the Greens to also come into power and push like policies in Netherlands as well. Say, for example, what's already happening in Norway and Finland, which means you increase the political will to shift towards more greener parties and essentially ensure that they get more seats in the parliament and there's more amount of political will towards this cause. That is the political scenario that's going to change. On their side of the house, you'll have more right-wing people like Giorgio Meloni in Italy, or say, for example, the Conservative Party in the UK, or say, for example, the Marine Le Pen in France, gaining more amount of power when they can displace the political will and essentially say that we can continue to do emissions, continue to burn fossil fuels, literally the Republican agenda that essentially you should continue to do so because climate change is not important. It's only created by China. So you should continue to burn fossil fuels. That does not happen when you don't essentially have degrowth prioritized as the main agenda that essentially vast number of people are likely to opt into. That is the swing in the political spectrum we get. That is likely to happen and only going to happen on our side of the house. Point at which when you implement degrowth, you push more green parties, you push more political agenda in the West to essentially adopt this. The multiple benefits out of it. Firstly, in terms of principle that they don't respond to, which means the Western countries essentially have the moral imperative to do this because they were the reasons in terms of why climate change happened initially. The reason why like UK became rich because it burned huge amounts of fossil fuel in the 1600s in Manchester to do the industrial revolution. France almost cleared the entirety of its rainforest to essentially ensure that it industrialized as a nation. These were the countries that essentially opted into the industrial revolution and created the problem of pollution in the first place. That's why they have the moral imperative to take the higher ground at this point of time and implement degrowth than developing countries. But also want to make the comparative clear. Point at which when you essentially ensure that the blame or the impetus is essentially put on the developed world, at that point you cannot symmetrically displace blame, which means on their side of the house, developed countries also have the so-called like ability to essentially displace blame on the developing world. They can literally also force the developing world to rather degrowth than the developed world. This literally looks like EU sanctioning Brazil when Brazil actually needs to clear a part of the rainforest for its industrial growth. This literally looks like US threatening India to essentially cut down its so-called emissions because otherwise it's going to sanction it. Point at which when you ensure that the responsibility is solely placed on the developed world, at that point of time you have more clarity of approach, which is you give comparatively more amount of leeway to the developing world. We told you principally why it's okay to do it to the developing world, but also because more people in the developing world are on the line, which is there are more people there who live 9 to 5 jobs who are right there on the poverty line, which means at that point of time, if you displace blame over there, like either sanction them or essentially reduce the amount of things they can export as what happened with the EU and Brazil, I think at that point of time, more number of people in the developing world are likely to suffer because they're more on the economic fringes and the economic lines, like what do you call, right there on the poverty line. Like them losing their job means way more than, say, for example, a person losing their job in Norway, because even reducing the amount of income, because the person in Norway apparently is not someone who's on the line, but as you'll reduce some drinks at the bar on the weekend, but it's not that you'll essentially not be able to put food on the table. That's the comparative, and I think it puts blame like specifically more and puts the impetus specifically more on the developed world. But the pragmatic impact out of it, which they don't, and this is why we win the green tech clash. Point at which, when there is more amount of greener policies, you have the EU policies magnified. You have more tax cuts to greener companies. You have more amount of EU stimulus packages that are given to green companies like Tesla. You have more impetus for Volkswagen and Audi to also shift to green production lines that they essentially opt into, which means you have a faster development of greener tech in the European Union and in the West. The reason why, because the West apparently is the place that has the resources to do it and has the surplus capital to do it. Because most of the companies are also based over there. Most of the people like Elon Musk are from the West because they had more fancier educations and in a better position to do it than the developing world. Which means if this doesn't happen, then greener technology develops slowly on their side, when they can continue to do emissions, when you have more amount of right-wing backlash against things like giving surplus capital to greener companies. That's what's happening, say, for example, that literally was Marine Le Pen's counter policy, which means at that point of time, you develop technology faster on our side of the house, which is the climate neutral goal that France said in 2050 can be achieved in 2040 right now, or that it's said in 2030 can be achieved sooner, which means you ensure that the technology is something that's available to the world faster. This also means that more number of companies essentially come up and you democratize the market. Like Op can say, well, companies can then hegemonize the amount of technology and not ensure it goes to a developing world. No, because companies then, when you essentially have developed the technology, you want to expand into newer markets. That's why like Tesla is essentially setting up factories in Bangalore right now or in India to ensure that it can expand into the developing world. But the reason why Tesla could get efficient, because it got those subsidies, etc., from the West, and it could, and like more companies essentially would opt into the bandwagon, point at which when you develop them even more, like Volkswagen, Audi, etc., that can also like start green production lines or like greener cars, say, for example, in parts of the developing world. You get the technology faster, they'll ensure that they want to enter into new markets then subsequently, and ensure that the technology trickles down faster into the developing world, ensuring that it happens way better. But thirdly, I think it also reduces reliance on the third point that they go ahead and say, in terms of like, say, for example, it puts you vulnerable to the Russia, Ukraine, whatever. I think technology is more egalitarianly likely to be distributed than, say, for example, things like natural resources, like non-renewables, like coal, petroleum, which is some countries will always have the upper hand because they're not things that you can produce. Rather, greener technology is something that you can easily export and essentially create a more egalitarian space for this to happen. What this does, it ensures that the technology develops faster on our side of the house, and you have a greater amount of political will, point at which when you push the degrowth narrative on these developed countries. But lastly, this also means that, like, and also I'm not sure in terms of why infrastructure and those things and money is not going to be high, because look, point at which it's not people becoming unproductive. I think people are becoming more efficient. We're going to counterpose it. That means people in the developing world, say in India, they work 9 to 5, 6 days a week. But point at which we will still posit that people in, say, for example, even if they work 4 days a week, they still reach the same level of productivity or income, but as better because you're in a better mental health and in a better mental health condition to essentially go ahead and do so, which is a more focus on individuals' freedom, say, for example, better mental health conditions, all of those things that can happen that you otherwise don't get. For all those reasons,
Thank you, second affirmative, for that fine speech. I would like to welcome the second negative.
I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
I'd first like to note that the F team really doesn't want to take any trade-off. They say that there is not going to be any economic repercussions because we always have what we need, and they go back to this example of Norway. If they want all of their benefits in the developed world, then they have to
agree that the entirety of the developed world will become degrowth, which means that there will be far less innovation or far less capital to use in things like innovation or things like the investments in abroad and locally, which puts you into the perspective of what economy really means to environment and how it really is important to green technology. I'll prove to you why, number one, the economy is prerequisite to climate security, and this breaks the deadlock on green technology. Secondly, I'll give you an argument on the developing world. And lastly, I'll give you an argument on how companies are required for climate change, dealing with the last bit of what the speaker before me said. Firstly, on the economy being the prerequisite to climate security, they argued how this is not going to have any economic repercussions. It's because, number one, it's only in the countries like Norway and Sweden. And number two, it doesn't have inflation because supply is just going to be low and demand will inherently be lower as well, as they assert. This is categorically untrue because inflation happens when there is extremely high demand. And I think that a lot of people still will be in high demand of things like energy, right? Like, because on government on affirmative side, you will never have the ability to like produce more energy because you want to descale a lot of your companies. Things that are consumer based will also be inherently much lower. The comparative here is, the comparative on affirmative is that there is demand for things like consumer based goods, or there is demand for energy, but you're unable to access those things specifically because you have degrowth the entire nation. Companies have become much smaller. Infrastructure has become far few and far in between, which means that demand is still high, but supply is extremely low. That's when inflation and recession increases more. But secondly, we argue, regardless of if inflation happens in the immediate fact, what happens is inflation would probably happen in the future. So this is because if it's true that the climate crisis is going to get increasingly worse, we argued how when the climate crisis gets increasingly worse, like we would need more capital in the future to make us better off when those things occur, right? So when forest fires occur way more, we need more capital to survive from those forest fires, which means that we need a lot more capital. This proves that economy is a prerequisite to climate security because now we need this money in order to survive. Now the clash on green technology, they argued how this is principally harmful, number one, and number two, how like developing worlds will never be able to actually get green technology at all, and the developed world is the best suited for this. Firstly, let's engage with the principles. Sure, I agree that the developed world has caused way more atrocities in the world in terms of the climate, but you just prove a principal need. You don't really prove a principle like why this is the only roadmap in order to satisfy this principal need. We argued a lot of mitigation and a lot of counterfactor as to how we can survive, we can satisfy this principle in other ways, which is like climate accords across the country, which is like reducing consumption through like things like personal responsibility and recycling. We also support things like movements when we acquire stocks in really wealthy companies. These things are way more effective because we have more capital in general and you do not lower the ability for us to access other opportunities. The way for this is when you put yourself in degrowth movement, you are unable to access all of these other alternatives because all of these other alternatives require a significant amount of capital and resources. But we'll prove to you the comparative here as well, and we flip this argument on the green technology because our counterfactual is the way to satisfy this principal need is for the developed world to care about the green technology, and I agree that the developing world does not probably care about the green technology anyway. We proved to you how developed world is way more is far better at accessing the green technology and innovating them because research is inherently expensive. If both of us agree the developing world is suffering as a result of climate, then we also agree that developed world is the one that is the most the better off in the entire world. Therefore, they're the most capable to actually come up with the green technology. But secondly, we have even though in the best case scenario on affirmative, well, they have green technology, these things will not be accessible to everyone in society. Given the nature of green technology, you need a lot of economies and a lot of countries to utilize green technology. When you have significantly less capital, you make it extremely inaccessible for everyone to access green technology, and that's particularly harmful. Their best response to this here is that they won't give how green technology will still exist on that side of the house, and how this policy creates a realization and how states will probably push more into green technology. The first response I have here, and we argue this in first, is that fossil fuels are generally expensive, which means a lot of states already have an impetus to to invest into green technology already, and they know that fossil fuel is not renewable, and that's why states are already prioritizing things like renewable energy. That's why half of the EU is already prioritizing renewable energy. This is devoid of the degrowth movement. All of the examples on EU exist in the status quo and not in the future potential of the degrowth. But secondly, they like a lot of green technology or green parties in general also admit that businesses are important for the economy, and that's how you push in more buy-in for these green parties. That's why the Greens work with the Catholic Party in Germany, because they require that business investment, require that lobbying power in order to get any changes in the government. But the comparative case is far worse, because if they want to push us Marine Le Pen and how right-wing populism affects more people, it affects way more people on affirmative side, specifically because people are suffering as a result of the economy and inflation. That becomes the voting issue. That becomes the most important issue in the entire election cycle. That's when all of these populist parties are more likely to gain traction, more likely to argue against the green technology and saying how these green parties are the ones that are taking away investments. That is the harm that exists exclusively on that side of the house, because you don't get buy-in in the future for the green parties. Assuming we both care about the green parties, you eradicate the possibility of survival of these green parties in the election cycle. So our argument on degrowth in the developed world cripples the third world. Yes, it is in the developed world, but they would have required the developing world to be strong as well in the fight against climate crisis. How is the developing world and the developed world connected? Firstly, the developing world receives trade from the developed world. This looks like how China supplies manufacturing to a lot of developing countries across Asia. Secondly, they rely on a lot of international agreements that are initiated by the developed world. This looks like RCEP in Asia. Thirdly, they rely on them for food security, like how Latin America imports a lot, like wheat from North America, and imports a lot of food from North America. This proves that a chunk of each of these developing countries is tied to the developed world. Harms here are simple. Number one, it cripples the economy of the developing world once the developed world becomes degrowth, because there will be rising inflation, there will be lack of food security, literally because they are not creating their own food, but they're importing. Now that import is gone because development world has to prioritize themselves, as they say. This is immediate shock to the economy, and people die because they have insufficient funds to survive the next day. And that's the damage of climate on the developing world, and the damage on the econs is equal. But at worst, people die far quicker on the affirmative side, literally because they don't have enough money in the immediate situation. But secondly, there's a lot of reliance on investment, and you need a lot of these MNCs for investment. And this is crucial to access climate activism, because people care only when their priorities are met, and you won't care if your investments run away, because that will become more important. And lastly, you suffer worse atrocities from the climate crisis when you do not have enough capital. Because when forest fires occur, and you want to call a firefighter, the firefighters have an off day because it's the climate crisis. That's what happens exclusively on that side of the house, because you need gas to go to work, but you're unable to access that because it's so damn expensive. In the absolute best case on earth, you have a developed world that is very, very strong and has a lot of green technology, but you make the developing world trapped in a system that with no ability to survive from the climate crisis. You survive on the climate crisis in developed world, but you die on the developing world. We take stupid.
Thank you, second negative, for that fine speech. I would like to welcome third affirmative.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
All right, great. Give me a second. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I want you to note that the entire case and all benefits are contingent on this one assertion, that on Gov, the economy contracts, and as a consequent, investment also goes down. I want you to see the context slide again. The context slide clearly mentions that you contract your GDP. That means you don't increase the number of goods that are manufactured or consumed within your own borders or within your own economy in the first place. That does not mean the money you have is going to sit it in a bank account and not go anywhere. I think what we do uniquely on our side, and this is where they miss the nuance in the first two speeches, what we do uniquely on our side is that we force investments into developing nations on a more aggressive level level than what currently status quo looks like. Why? Because we now know that you can't produce goods in your own economy, but the money is there, so you now push them to go ahead and invest or make more solar power plants in India for that matter, right? I think that is the nuance they miss, and this is where trickle down becomes even more aggressive on our side, and that means the economic assertion that they say that economy is going down. I think economy just goes down as in terms of contraction of GDP and not in terms of investment that you can actually make or the money you have to make those investment in the first place. I think that defeats all arguments that come from second negative, because their entire claim is this, that economy is prerequisite to climate solutions. I agree, but if those climate solutions are just restricted to the developed world, I think then the solutions that you actually need in developing nations never reach there. And as a consequence, what happens is that these countries continue to work in the current cycle of climate change that exists, and they probably just worsen the climate even more. I think the status quo looks in this world. The status quo in this world looks like this, right? Climate change is ever increasing, but developed nations are just saying that, hey, listen, we have 2030 goals, we have 2040 goals, and we don't need to do anything else because we'll solve and reach net climate zero in our own home countries. I think the race to the bottom that exists currently makes the developing world even worse off, because developing worlds are uniquely blamed for worsening the climate in status quo, with countries with developed nations going ahead and sanctioning those developing nations which produce like more carbon or carbon like dioxide. But secondly, I think these developing nations are not given an avenue to go ahead and even solve this problem in the first place. I think that lack of avenue, primarily due to lack of trickle down, that the green tech can come on green tech, is the reason why the climate change is never getting solved on the comparative on their side. What we do on our side, and this is the clearest example I can think of, instead of going ahead and developing a hydrogen fuel cell in your own in USA for that matter, just give like EV trucks or lithium ion batteries to India to go ahead and make more like to start more EV cars and EV trucks on the road. I think initializing climate change or green tech solutions in developing nations should matter more than going ahead and improving these things in the developed world as in their best case scenario, right? I think I'll just deal with why on 4 metrics we stand to win this debate. One, faster development. There are 2 mechanisms we give you for this, right? Firstly, if you have shorter work weeks, you probably have better mental health of people. That means people are probably more efficient in their work. Like, and this is just to say that shorter work weeks probably means that you are more satisfied with your job. You can probably spend time with your family more. So you're probably okay with working that job and giving your best in the 4 days a week you're going to the particular job in the first place, right? This means better efficiency in the kind of work you do. And that means that probably trickles down to things like R&D and also works in things like science and green tech for that matter, or in companies for that matter. So you probably have better development of green tech, primarily because people are satisfied in working and researching and just working in those companies in the first place. But second, and this is the more important bit, I think the policy of degrowth probably means that political will also shifts, and the window of political operation in these countries in developed worlds also shifts from going ahead and not competing against the climate change solutions, but rather working for them, right? This is where the current status quo becomes so important. Note at all points, there's always a counter narrative to climate change, where literally presidents of USA or Donald Trump going ahead and saying that climate change is not real. I think those counter narratives just go out when you focus on degrowth and not on growth. Because I think the standard notion or the assumption in the world is that growth only comes about when you exploit more and you use more resources. However, if you go ahead and you focus on degrowth more, I think the utilization of resources as a consequence also goes down. That means there's no counter narrative to the kind of climate change proposals or green parties that exist. And that means that faster development of green tech happens on our world, because there's no counter push to the idea of green tech or development of green tech solutions in the first place. But second metric on which we debate, and they never engage with this, right? I think it's more efficient to go ahead and make sure that the kind of tech you're producing doesn't eat into the gains. The kind of tech you're producing doesn't like get mitigated by the kind of consumption you're making. So if you're increasing consumption, you're probably increasing the kind of the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced in the first place. So if meat consumption increases, greenhouse gases also increase as a consequence. That means even if you create a solar power plant, I think the benefits you get by the solar power plant is cut into by increasing consumption on their side of the house. If you reduce consumption as a consequence, the benefits that you gain out of developing that green tech stay like on this sort of sliding scale, stay more, as opposed to like on the comparative when they're cut into by the increasing consumption of developed world in the first place. I think that means efficiency of green tech also gets retained on our side of the house better. Third, and this is the most important metric, trickle down into developing nations. I think when you have money, and you force Tesla to not say produce cars or EV cars in USA, because Tesla, you'll probably put a cap, and this is something like what Degrowth looks like. You probably put a cap and you just contract the size of your economy. So probably like, you reduce the consumption, you reduce the production of Tesla cars in USA. That probably means that Elon Musk has an ample money to go ahead and invest in India because he's looking for new markets, right? I think you just force investment downstream because these companies have the money to go ahead and invest in these countries in the first place. So instead of producing back home, you produce somewhere else. This means as a consequence, accessibility and economic investment into developing nations increases. That solves the metric what DLO gives, what's the second negative gives us, because they say that, okay, it will cripple the economy of the developing world if you increase inflation. Firstly, I don't think when inflation increases because consumption is decreasing and inflation depends on demand. But also in the second frame, I think I just go ahead and say that if you increase investment into developing world, they can probably handle the economies much better. Inflation won't affect them as much as they want to deposit, right? So you force investment downstream on ourselves house uniquely, and those investments will be more aggressive than what status quo looks like, primarily because you're not allowing them to go ahead and invest in their own countries because GDP has been restricted and contracted to an extent, right? So you have limited scope of play. You would limit the playing field for these countries in their home bases. And thirdly, and then lastly, and this is the most important bit, I don't think they deal sufficiently with this. I think the principle of reparation that comes from first positive and that has never been thoroughly engaged with still stands. I think developed countries created this problem for the developing nations in two ways. Number one, the kind of position they have in society came as a consequence of them harming the climate. So that looks like France going and burning forests to create or industrialize their country in the first place. But secondly, developing nations are not allowed to go ahead and deal with this issue primarily because you fucked them over, because you took away their economies, you conquered them, and you never allowed them to reach that particular social position in society. This means that on two levels, the principle of reparations weighs up over anything else that they say, and this is why we say that the focus should be sent on them and developed world, and not on the developing nations, which are currently blamed in status quo for the kind of issues they have. I think we win this debate primarily on the impact of certainty and which sides is better able to solve the solution. Certainly, I think the certainty that they say of tech development, I think when climate change or worsening of climate change happens at a greater proportion than development of tech, you probably can never solve this problem. And it's uncertain when this will, they go ahead and match and counteract each other. On our side, when you force the kind of like 20-30 agreements and you force investment downstream, you probably are able to go ahead and make sure that developing nations are at least able to meet the basic requirement so they can at least start reversing climate change in their own health. So on scale, we're able to get more certain impacts from the comparative, and for all those reasons proposed.
All right, thank you, third affirmative, for that fine speech. I would like to welcome the third negative.
Hi, am I audible and visible? All right, give me a second.
Yes, you're audible and visible.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When you purge the economy, when you basically ensure that a lot of consumption and production is going to be reduced, when it comes at the cost of people losing their jobs, and when it comes at the cost of the purchasing power for individuals just significantly lowers, when push comes to shove, this is the moment where states have to use a lot of money to ensure that individuals are actually able to just get the most basic necessities for their own lives. But you can't do that because you don't have money, because you've already purged your economy, because the production and the consumption has already been reduced. That's the world that affirmative is living in right now. Up until the third speaker, they refuse to take the burden that was given to them, even if it says already in the info slide where you have to significantly descale your own economy, which means you have to descale your own production and your own consumption. It comes at a innate cost of just a lot of money, or the GDP of a certain country would actually just deteriorate even more. But no, affirmative didn't want to do that. Affirmative just want to go on the principle and assume that it's precisely because all developed states are exactly just like Norway and exactly just like Sweden and Finland, and states actually have some form of capacity to do so. We say no, that's a world that is too idealistic and extreme and very, very much convenient under their side that the debate cannot stand. What I'm going to do today is two things. First and foremost, I'll just give two issues. Firstly, on the principle on whether developed states should actually continue with their own economies, and the second issue of which side has the high capacity to develop green technology. Let's take a look at the first issue on principally why developed nations should continue with their own economies, right? The affirmative gives you the argument that directly reducing emissions is one that is going to be good for the economy, because naturally, when you actually decrease the consumption and the production, then a lot of individuals are able to just breathe greener at the end of the day. Two problems here. First and foremost, they completely neglected my first speaker's second argument, which is directly affecting how it would affect the rest of the world when it comes to developing states just cutting down on their production. Firstly, it's because developed nations supplies to the rest of the world. If you take a look at America and Canada, for example, when they export actually good vegetables throughout the rest of the world, when that becomes their main export, and when the countries, when you start actually cut down on those things, not only are you going to hurt the farmers in your own developed nations, but also you're going to hurt the economy, because that is your main form of exports. If you take a look at Russia, also, for example, where their main export is oil, and when the rest of the world is suddenly just sanction Russia for their own oil, right? This is where we see a lot of the repercussions push towards Russia, where they actually lose a lot of money along the way, which would directly translate to how their investment towards the welfare would actually go for, right? But also, secondly, we also say that it's going to reduce employment in its entirety. Affirmative just cannot say that all developed nations have a basic business model, just like Norway, where every single citizen of Norway just have some form of investments within the state that is equivalent to just $1 million per year, right? For example, not all developed states have that form of wealth capital for individuals to ensure that they can actually get a good life. If you take a look at America, for example, I think it's going to exacerbate a lot of the minorities in America even more, who are actually just innately poor because of the business model that they try to run under the side of affirmative. But the second problem here is they contend to you that it becomes a state obligation to reduce these emissions because they're the ones who contributed towards the most. We say we also fulfill the obligation that's already been given in my first speaker, which is there are three reasons why there are incentives for the world right now to just be more green, right? First and foremost, we actually promote ethical consumption, so it becomes more aware for individuals to make sure that they buy actual good things. But also, secondly, we also pressure companies that also contribute to the climate change, right? For example, we pressure companies like H&M or even just Uniqlo that actually contributes to the mass wastage of just textile in the rivers that they actually throw into. But also, thirdly, we also support universal agreements to fight for certain climate change. That's why we have the climate summit. That's why we have the Paris Agreement in the first place. The main contention, the main problem with affirmative is that they did not disprove why these forms of incentive or even just policies are not enough for it to become a state obligation, especially the developing world, to actually fight the climate change, right? What do we then contend under this issue? We contend two things. First and foremost, the main important thing for you to do when it comes to just fighting climate is you need the amount of capital security. The first reason is because you need money to actually create groundbreaking technologies. I don't think we can get this far enough to actually develop in terms of our own green tech if it wasn't for the money that we get from the oil rigs, if it wasn't for the money that we get from actually just having a lot of these bad factories that contributes to the climate change, right? We're definitely taking the trade-off of maybe right now a lot of people would suffer the repercussions of having climate change in the first place. But if climate change right now is so far ahead, it requires you to have a lot of capital for you to solve in the first place, then this is the best spot for us to actually start investing in green tech because we have the capitals to do so. But the second reason why we need capital is because we want to deal with other long-term crises that happens in the future as well. If say, for example, we need to have some form of aid for certain countries, or for some reason we are going to head towards the recession era, where we actually need to ensure that a lot of people can still have their own livelihoods, that's where we need capitals the most. And that's where we can get that our side of the house. But last but not least is just the expansion towards developing nations as well. I think the benefit that comes from affirmative is probably developed states are going to be the ones that's going to benefit the most, but it comes at the cost of actually screwing over developing nations completely, because a lot of developing nations actually just rely on this developed states in the first place, which leads to the way, on the urgency to use money for survivability. I think when more climate crisis occurs, this is where we are in the best position to actually solve with that. But the second thing that we contend under this issue is that developing states just relies on the capabilities of developed states. Two reasons. First and foremost is because of food security imports. I think we see this likely further within the EU and within South America. But also secondly is in terms of just the international relation agreements that big nations have with the smaller nations in order for them to develop their economies even further. So this is why we say, panel, we went on the principle of why developed states should just proceed with the economies that they still have. Let's take a look at the second issue then, on which side has the high capacity to develop green tech.
three things were posited to you in this debate. First and foremost is on affirmative, you significantly have lesser capital. Three problems here. First and foremost, it's harder for you to actually have research and development because now you're actually just flipping over a lot of economies to have lesser capabilities. But also, secondly, it's harder for you to invest in startups, which is the benefit that comes from affirmative, because now a lot of these companies or just a lot of states have the lesser political will to invest in these startups because you have the lesser GDP. But thirdly, it's also harder for you to subsidize your green tech because you have that lesser capital in the first place. But the second problem that we contend to here is now we have lesser political will to actually fight for climate change. This is precisely because when you descale a lot of the economy, you're going to lose a lot of jobs. For example, if you take a look at how we want to descale a lot of factories that actually contribute to the economy the most likely individuals that are going to lose their jobs are just blue-collar workers or just like middle-class income workers who actually prioritize the survivability over anything else. So this is what we say. Now we have lesser political support towards fighting climate change because these are the same individuals who are going to lobby towards the government to say that no, we don't have climate change reduction even more because it comes at the cost of our jobs actually losing. And these are the same individuals who are just innately poor and they're going to be trapped in the lower class at the end of the day. The conclusion here is that the best case that is possible on the side of affirmative is sure, you can have subsidization for green tech, you can have a lot of investments towards green tech, but the scale of the possibility of that happening is going to be significantly lower because you have to rely on the small amounts of capital that you have now after descaling the economy. The comparative on our side is we've already provided to you a lot of incentives for states and also just for companies to actually go forward green tech, right? First and foremost, because a lot of companies want to have the first move. Meaning to say they have in the first move in that within that like driving industry, then they're most likely going to be the biggest producer and the manufacturer for the technology. But also secondly, it's precisely because of other alternatives are just much more expensive and non-renewable, which makes a lot of companies just change their business models towards green tech. So proud to propose.
Great, thank you, Sir Negative, for that fine speech. I would like to welcome the negative reply.
I'd like to make a clarification at the top of this reply. Because is degrowth really subsidizing money into green companies, or is it merely reducing the growth of a lot of companies? Because we argued that it's the latter, and how Gov can never really fiat things like subsidizing all of these good green tech companies because they never prove how they get that money to begin with. But let's entertain this logic. The only way for them to get a lot of money for subsidies is to have all of what they say, which is that you have to have all the bad companies shut down. You have to have less people working and tax them heavily in order to get all of that money, and you have to reduce a lot of productivity in order to survive from the climate crisis. And at the end of all of that, maybe you can have some money to subsidize a lot of these companies. We were never contesting that you didn't have money at all. We were contesting the scale of the money that is being injected into these companies. We argued how a lot of things that are the roadmaps to surviving the climate crisis require a lot of capital. It is green technology that requires a lot of experimentation and it's inherently a resource intensive procedure. It is like making it accessible to society that is important for us to get out of the climate crisis. We compare that to how inherently a lot of companies have ability to invest and how the developed world should take this responsibility to create that green technology. And that actually bites them in the ass on Gov, because if they argue that there is a developed country that really has a lot of money for green technology, what we're arguing is we co-opt all of that, we use all of that money for green technology. The question then becomes, have they really proven a marginal increase in green technology and its benefits on that side of the house, given that they have significantly little capital? I don't think they have. First observation on the principle. They argue how the principle is important because the developed world suffers so bad, commit a lot of atrocities into the climate. We argued how the principle doesn't matter because the debate is about pragmatic outcomes to survive the climate crisis. But let's entertain this logic as well. Their principle is if you cause a harm onto the environment, then the obvious answer to that is degrowth. But have they really proven that this is a good alternative in every single instance? Because we argue to you, when the developed world degrows, the developing world suffers the most. We argued all of the harms of what happens when the developing world degrows themselves. If you buy all of the principal analysis on affirmative, then you have to concede that all of the harms on the developing world exist to a far larger extent, because these developing countries as well also degrowth and cripple their economy. First issue on how money is important to survive the climate crisis. They argue all these small things on how people are motivated, then they have more productivity and all stuff like that. We didn't mind that because I think that's fine. But these were never the things that created and made us survive from the climate crisis. It was inherently money that survived that would have made us survive the climate crisis because of it being resource intensive as well to get green technology. We win this case. On the second question, the developing world, they argue how in the worst case, the developed world actually screws over the developing world. We argued, sure, maybe that's true, but the developed nation is where all the money is really at, which means that they didn't contest this at all. What we argue here, that maybe it's bad, the developed world is bad in the shady dealings that they have with the developing world, but it's still deals that are still very important to the developing world. What we argue here is that you lose a lifeline to survive from the climate crisis. So in the absolute best case scenario, and we buy all of the benefits on F, we survive the climate crisis, but you only survive for the developed world. Only the people who would have survived it anyway through green technology that they would have probably invested in anyway would have survived. But the people who are left behind eternally and in perpetuity are the people in the developing world. That is the most vulnerable in this debate we have to go through. Thanks.
Thank you, negative reply, for that fine speech. I would like to welcome the affirmative reply.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly on narrative, then on change. Their biggest push in this round, and this is a prerequisite for them to get all impacts, is that more poor people are likely to lose their jobs. And essentially, that's why they're essentially going to revolt. And that's the problem in which perhaps the right would get more amount of power, and this will be displaced. We argued from speech 1 in terms of why these are developed countries. They have a high GDP per capita. There are strong welfare policies. There are labor laws and minimum wages that are mandated, which is more likely to look like countries that are surplus capital in terms of other developed countries in the West, such as Norway, Sweden, or even France. They said that and this is when they say in op-whip, it cannot be utopia. Then what is it that they never prove in their speeches? Because that frame is correct, that these are advanced developed countries. Then at that point of time, just unsure in terms of why, like, this is anything different from this in terms of what we mentioned. But secondly, then they said that perhaps it could be countries like America also, that perhaps there's a divide. And here's the most important, crucial tipping point, I think, in this round. We told you that in the absence of a degrowth, at that point of time, there's likelihood of political ambiguity. That is to say, you don't know essentially what to do, and that is the literal breeding ground for Republicans and the right wing to push back against it. But secondly, it is that political ambiguity, as Angad then points out, that like generates that counter narrative. That's to say, firstly, developed countries don't acknowledge the problem. It's like, who should degrowth? Then they would say that developing countries should degrowth, as EU literally pushed the blame on Brazil. We thought that displacement of the blame happens more, point at which when there is no clarity in terms of who should degrowth. First, on principle, you should degrowth because we give you a bunch of reasons why developed countries cause the problem first. But secondly, you reduce this political ambiguity, which means we had the fiat on our side of the house to say that developed countries prioritize degrowth. At that point of time, you reduced emissions and you focus more on greener technology. Then they said that everything is reliant on investment and this country's economy so-called drastically shifts, as written in the info slide. That's a lie that they say in op-whip. But secondly, I think even if it marginally shrinks, we already did the weighing on second half, that why incentive is more important for you to invest, because even if you have more money but you don't have incentive and there is political ambiguity and bipartisan deadlock, you're never going to pass that policy through. That is what they had to contest, rather than just by saying some is already, here's why we also take them at their best, which means then the best case that they say is some development is already happening in the EU. No, we already argued in Debayan that there's urgency to the problem. There's literally like wildfires and heat waves over 40 degrees Celsius, which means some development is not enough. You need like drastic urgent development right now. That's why it's important for you to consolidate political will and ensure that there is no political ambiguity in that stance. That's the reason why we win on that urgency metric. But secondly, then in terms of pragmatics, note, I don't think this next team has any benefit on the developing world, because they never prove in terms of why you develop better greener technology, but also why there's any reason for you to outsource the same, but even to help the environment. Angad points out that point at which if consumption continues to increase, then at that point of time, the harm to the environment also increases. So at that point of time, they never essentially solve the problem. What we told you and why does that stand? Firstly, we told you that point at which when you have more political will to develop capital, we outline policies for you, more tax breaks to green companies, more amount of surplus capital and startup capital to these companies, more amount of companies developing, democratizing the market even more. Then the companies have an incentive to expand into newer markets, because you want to expand the investments and outsource investments, as Angad points out in GovWhip, that receive no response, which means these companies are then more likely to develop better technology and set up firms such as what Tesla is doing in India. That's literally when you have better technology and more efficient technology at your disposal, because you urgently prioritized it and developed it. That is the point at which you get faster change, because in the absence of this, when you play the blame game in terms of who should degrowth and not, that's the point at which developed countries won't essentially get this technology, like develop this technology faster. We develop this faster and then essentially we ensure that the developing world then benefits out of it when this technology literally trickles down. But secondly, then it also ensures that people in the developing world don't suffer when you don't essentially do this like political displacement or blame game, because at the end of the day, their alternatives don't work, because like you literally pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, being the US, when you have that political ambiguity, and movements etc. require consistent political will, which you only get through our side, and we told you why it's urgent and immediate for you to do so. Affirmative.
All right, thank you, affirmative reply for that fine speech. I think that concludes the round. Before asking